Part 14 of X. There Was a Man, the Saga of Gordon Kahl, a True Story. The top of page 123. Grandma later filed a claim against the government, which was disallowed. The task force had to return to square one in its pursuit of Grandpa. The next day in Fargo, Chief Deputy Marshal Ron Evans said he hoped to have Kahl in custody by sunset, but he declined to say how he might do that. He also said the suspect was holed up, but this turned out to be false. Scott Fall had told the agents where to find his rifle, and it was retrieved. Marshal Kupferer led the press to believe that his grid and search techniques was responsible for recovery of the Mini 14. Most of the search team stayed at a motel in Jamestown. They consoled themselves and the press by saying, "At least we have 5 of the 6 in custody." Needless to say, the whole affair received national and intense statewide publicity, with some notable local exceptions. The press coverage was inaccurate and detrimental to the Medina Six. To counter this somewhat, Lynn Martin and some of the wives started issuing periodical news pamphlets providing their version of the developments to patriot groups across the nation. Reporters interviewing Heaton residents to learn about Grandpa wrote some Kahl quotations. Income tax came from the second plank of the Communist Manifesto. Communism is Satanist. Call it the 10 Commandments of Satan. I'm going to try to live by God's law as long as possible. When it isn't possible anymore, we'll have to die trying. I've gone as far as I can. World War III is going to start when they come. Grandpa's daughter, my Aunt Lorene, told reporters she didn't believe it was necessary for authorities to use such force to enter the house. I knew my dad wasn't in there, she said. I don't know where he is, and I don't want to know either. This is unbelievable, remarked her sister, Lonnie. They're hunting him like a dog. At the assault scene, one observer commented, "Well, even if he is not in there, this can be a hell of a training exercise." Apparently, this is exactly what it was, wrote the Bismarck Tribune. Lynn Martin, God bless him, ran the American Christian School at Ashley, which had only a handful of students. 4 days after the shootout, the task force sealed off Ashley for about 4 hours. Some 40 officers plus canine dogs searched 2 homes, a veterinarian's clinic, and Martin's school upstairs. No probable cause existed for the search other than Blaise' remark. This was a logical place for him to be. Persons owning the properties were members of the patriotic community. We've got to go back and regroup, Blake concluded. Of course, Grandpa was probably far into the South by then. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Yori was beginning to show good signs of recovery. He was allowed no visitors, messages, newspapers, or TV. This irritated Dr. Caustic, who wanted the support of relatives to give Yori the correct environment for recovery. The guards would say, "I'm not allowed to talk with you, to answer your questions." Yori asked them to get someone who could talk. The federal agents were waiting for this opportunity not to answer Yori's questions, but to interrogate him. Yori was under heavy sedation from Demerol and thyroxine, but appeared clear-headed to the agents. "I know you think I shot first, and I may have shot first, at the man in the white shirt, Cheshire." This was later to be admitted into evidence at the trial in May. Yori had been read his Miranda rights, but not having his attorney nor one offered, and feeling no guilt, freely conversed with the agents. A similar ambiguous confession was given the agents more formally 3 days later. He remained under the influence of drugs. He was arraigned in the hospital room, at which time he noticed the Masonic rings, which later disappeared. After 2 weeks, Yori, having made a tremendous recovery, was transferred to jail to await trial. Deputy Hobson was improving also in a Bismarck hospital. The U.S. attorneys were busy gathering evidence for the grand jury against their 5 captives. Bismarck attorney Irv Nodland, representing Scott Fall, filed an early objection with the court over the government's use of the term murderers at a hearing. "A jury decides whether this is so," he objected. "That's the charge, Your Honor," responded U.S. Attorney Crooks to Judge Benson, a fellow Mason. As portent and prologue of the pattern in the trial to come, the objection was overruled. FBI agent Dick Blay continued to labor under the mistaken assumption that Grandpa would remain in the area because of his wife's incarceration and his son's injuries. Dr. Martin's Medina Clinic was searched 8 days after the shootout without results. The marshals were beginning to have a strong suspicion that Gordon might be in Montana. Montana is one state in which the IRS does not ordinarily pursue tax violators criminally, as juries seldom convict, partly due to Red Beckman's public information efforts. Beckman is a farmer and author whose books focus on government criminality. This is Rudy and my personal commentary, as you've got to read the books by Red Beckman. He has passed away now, but he left us a legacy that's incredible, and you should definitely read his books. The FBI established 2 toll-free numbers to get leads on Grandpa. 9 federal agents were assigned to answer the calls around the clock. Numerous calls came in, but no useful information. The Marshal Service offered the biggest award in its history for information leading to Gordon Kahl, $25,000. This was the one move which eventually was to be fruitful in finding Grandpa. Grandma was persuaded to plead on TV with Grandpa to turn himself in. She did this only because she knew Grandpa. She knew he would know she was coerced into doing it. She knew he would pay no attention to it, even if he heard it. She knew it might cause the authorities to treat her less harshly. After a month, the task force had been reduced to 50 officers. Blay admitted that Grandpa might have the advantage of the rural countryside, different from a city manhunt. Blay asked one person friendly to Grandpa, "If you knew where he was, would you tell me?" After pondering the question, he replied, "Well, he's a friend." An Associated Press report quoted Blay in what was to be a precognitive and prophetic utterance. "You have someone like Kahl who could go to a farm in some remote area and be very happy for years and years. Unless someone happens to go to that farm and recognize him and notice, the odds of getting any information are far more remote than they would be in a much more urban setting." He said one solid lead, a call from someone who had seen Grandpa, would put them in good shape. "I'm optimistic," Blay said, "but yet I also realize that it might not necessarily be tomorrow. It may not necessarily be for several months." Every point Blay made was to become reality. Here is a letter from the Bismarck paper under the banner, "Questions Raised in Medina's Incident." Editor Tribune. How come this human being named Gordon Kahl is being judged guilty before anyone hears the other side of the story? It isn't that I do not believe my government is not of the law. It is that every story has 2 sides, and I want to hear both before I go gunning after a crazy man. Why arrest him with force? He didn't seem to pose any threats to those around him. Wouldn't anyone in his position try to protect themselves if they knew they were going to be set up and shot like animals? I guess I pay less attention to what people say than what they do. If a man does no harm and much good in his life, I would be unlikely to be afraid of him, even if he had some pretty weird political views. After all, we're supposed to be a free people. I do not believe in organizations that control one's thinking to such a degree that you refuse to listen to the other side. If any organization or government demands total control over its followers, it has the potential for another Holocaust. People are what count, and human rights must come first if we are to survive. And Scott Fall, he's different because he didn't believe in pesticides and fertilizers? My goodness, I have neighbors that don't believe in birth control or bangs vaccinating. Should we lock them up now or wait until they go berserk? History tells things such as what these different people are saying and doing, but they were heroes then because England was the government being harassed. If a nation uses evil means to secure its goals, it is an evil nation. Notice that I said if. My heart breaks for the families of each marshal lost. They didn't deserve to die. They were only doing their job. It is truly a senseless tragedy. May justice come to those truly responsible. Where did anyone get the idea that Kahl's dog was dangerous? I hope it wasn't local gossip. Heaven help me if the law is ever after me and all they know is gossip. or rather, heaven help my dogs. Allen Rhodes, McCluskey. That letter had a different tone from the most media coverage. The bad press for the Medina Six was pervasive. This angered Alvin Fall, Scott's father, in regard to Scott, which in turn became the basis of a Tribune article. Part of his anger was from the newspaper claiming that Alvin was a lobbyist for the Farmers Liberation Army, the FLA, reported the paper is an underground protest movement. Regarding Scott, I think he was drug into this by accident, Alvin said. This is Rudy. I'm going to put personal commentary. I've communicated with Scott Fall on the phone and letter many times, and I can tell you that he has now lost his father, Alvin Fall, but Alvin Fall was the biggest supporter of his son Scott that you've ever came across. Alvin Fall was a big supporter of Scott Fall, and it's a real shame that he's now dead because Scott Fall needs a family member to go visit him in prison. We'll pick up with the book. It's just one of a million calls we get every day, spouted a Watertown, South Dakota police officer. Frank Williams of Skyston had reported spotting Grandpa driving north on the interstate. After about 6 weeks, an APB was released describing Gordon's Green Rambler. The authorities claimed the reason this was not done earlier was to protect those who might otherwise confront Grandpa. Escape to Wisconsin is that state's tourism slogan. There, persons in truck painted in a camouflage pattern were originally questioned in the process of the Kahl hunt by sheriff's deputies, either with or without pistols drawn, near Waukesha. One of these, David Strode, was forced to post $634 bond for an $80 fine they said he owed Whitehall County. He then filed a $25,000 liability claim against Waukesha County and a like claim against Whitehall County for not recording his payment when he paid it the first time. Back in Dakota, the manhunt continued, spreading to other states, including Arkansas, as the weeks went by. In Great Falls, Montana, Blanchard Lean was aroused by a telephone call to his motel room. He was sternly ordered to come out with his hands up. The call was repeated seconds later. When he and his wife did come out, it was scary. They faced the barrels of 7 guns held by lawmen. All other guests had been called and told to stay put. The motel manager had tipped the authorities that Grandpa was there. 15 or 20 FBI agents and other officers responded. Lean got mad at first, but later he took the whole thing good-naturedly. Since the latter part of February, Grandpa was living at the home of Art Russell, a mile west of a mountain home in north-central Arkansas. In Arkansas, Grandpa was his own man, as always. An observer could remark, anyone who has a mind to take Gordon into custody and throw him in a cage like an animal is apt to go to hell in a hurry. He doesn't bother anyone and causes no trouble unless he's accosted. Grandpa's reverie must have wandered back to bygone happier times on occasion, like the time when Grandma was lecturing him about not letting Yori and Fred fool around with guns when they were quite young. Grandpa sat at the table eating and nodding his head affirmatively at his wife. Then Grandma opened the door when someone knocked. There stood 2 little tykes, each holding a mallard duck they had shot. Gun safety was drilled into them and became second nature. A friend of Grandma's was inspired to write, ravaged house, whitewashed, green trimmed, ripped by bullets, windows, blown away, walls, splintered, heirloom carpets stamped with muddied insignia of invading armies, rifle butts smashed the mirrors that held memories of generations, children's monkey faces, mothers smiling cheek to cheek with babies, babies becoming grandpas in the new land, the land that promised freedom and justice for all. Maureen Murphy, Heaton, North Dakota. Chapter 19, Shenanigans. A day or two after the shootout, a number of telephone maintenance trucks showed up in town. Telephone tapping was anticipated by the entire countryside. They were correct. Word was passed to residents by the authorities to leave their keys in their vehicles in the countryside. As a tactic, it was better to have Grandpa just to take one than to break into one and short-wire it, or to forcibly confront them to get a key. Those in the countryside generally complied, with some going a step further and filling the gas tank to the brim. Many neighbors were interrogated extensively. The neighboring farmer living closest to where the Medina police car had been abandoned was Glenn. He was a close friend to Grandpa's, though not sharing many of his opinions, and was a part-time policeman at Herdsfield. Like many neighbors, he was visited and questioned many times by the Federals during the Kahl hunt. Glenn is best described as a tall Swede, perhaps 55 years old. He once asked the two FBI agents who came to his house for their identification. They did not show it, asking instead, "What are you doing, writing a book?" "Then you are bums, aren't you?" "You've got a big mouth," they retorted. Glenn had told the federal agents before they desolated the farmhouse that Grandpa was not there. "How do you know?" they asked. "I went over there and their dog told me." "Oh, you know about that?" the agent responded, knowing that the dog acts differently when the place is vacant. The agents on various visits quizzed him about underground tunnels, mines, army tanks, and the whereabouts of Grandpa. The idea of tunnels came from certain neighbors' children playing in the past at the Kahl homestead. Playing in tall weeds, the small children made pathways through them with weeds leaning overhead. Thus tunnels were a possibility, a reality to the children. "Where do you and Gordon keep the M4A3 tank?" the federal agents were asking about. A neighbor once asked Glenn. "Right there in the loft," answered Glenn with a straight face, pointing to the barn. When Glenn got tired of the agents repeatedly asking him, "Where is Gordon?" he replied, "He's right behind you, probably." "What do you mean by that?" "Well, he's on his turf here, and he talks to the animals." Glenn replied. "How's that?" they asked. "Just to give you an example, we were deer hunting, and suddenly Gordon said that we might as well go home. Someone asked why, and he explained that the magpies had told him that where we are, so we'd just as well quit. Like I said, he talks to the animals, and if they told him you are here, he might be right behind you." On one occasion, Glenn argued with the agents over whether or not Grandpa should be allowed to use his telephone. They threatened him if he did, but Glenn contended if Gordon wanted to call and turn himself in, then he could use the telephone, citing the similarity of reporting an accident on the road in front of his home, a legal requirement. Once when the agents visited, he told one, "I wouldn't sit there." "I wouldn't sit there." When an agent had sat on the metal flour bin. "Why not? What's in it?" "Dynamite." Shortly after they left, two different agents came to check out the flour bin. Glenn, tired of the bother from the Federals and suspecting his phone was monitored, once said to a friend, Marvin Hammond, "Have you ever been in the Army?" "No." "Well, we're going to play a little Army game. I'll call you later today and tell you to execute Plan A, Schedule 3. Then you call me later." When Glenn called, Marvin's wife answered as Marvin wasn't home. She assured him that she would give her husband the message, Plan A, Schedule 3, execute. Marvin called Glenn back the next day, and he wasn't home. However, Glenn's wife took the message. Plan A, Schedule 3, has been completed. Within a few minutes, the federal agents were at his house, wanting to know what was coming down. "Who is Marvin?" Once, when the federal agents did show Glenn their badges, Glenn said, "I have one of those too." He showed them his badge, which he used in his part-time police duties. I got to tell you, I won't mention my friend's name, but this is personal commentary. We've often talked about if we think the feds are listening to our phone calls, we're going to talk about something big going down at the coast in the Gulf of Mexico, even though that it's just all made up stuff just to give the feds a hard time. Anyway, back with the book. The federal agents were never completely convinced that Glenn was not harboring Grandpa. For one thing, the Federals couldn't understand the people in the countryside calling one another so frequently as they actually did. Before the SWAT team attacked the Kahl house, Glenn wanted to prove to them that Grandpa wasn't there, but their no admittance sign on the road included no admittance for him too. Glenn had a barn and a round silo next to it. Hay was stacked alongside both of them. The resulting triangular area behind the hay was known as their small daughter's playhouse. When the federal agents queried Glenn about the playhouse where Grandpa might be hiding, he showed this to them. However, the federal agents would not look behind the hay. Could this reluctance have been from, oh well. For days, federal agents foolishly probed the false walls and tunnels regarding false walls. Why didn't they simply measure the outside and inside dimensions, Glenn wondered. Many of the Federals were from cities or from different climates. When the North Dakota prairie began being a strange environment, early one morning, on the theory that the culprit returns to the scene, 2 agents drove across the frozen field to the clump of trees where the Mercury was abandoned by Scott and Grandpa. They got stuck later when trying to leave. One of their problems was that they were unable to radio their location to others, no reference points. A waitress later told them, "When the frost leaves, the fields become muddy, as all Dakotans know." I imagine the other neighbors could provide similar revelations of the task force exploits, but those of Glenn are familiar examples, which he stoically shared with the populace of Heaton. I think maybe the problem with the task force was their philosophical approach. They are accustomed to dealing with common law criminals, rapists, bank robbers, and such, who by and large aren't all that smart, and who do not receive much empathy from friends and acquaintances. Grandpa, though, was highly intelligent, and never was rude or unkind to anyone in his entire life. He was loved and respected. His behavior while a fugitive was not the norm expected of a criminal. An old writer was soon to pen, "Ring the bell, sound the war trumpet, a soldier of our race has died. Visions of Vikings, standing at the gate to Valhalla, arms outstretched in salute to one another, brave warrior. Listen, Leonidas calls. Who is the man that dares to equal the courage of my brave 300? Who is this that so boldly treads upon the ground where my men have stood in blood-stained honor for 2,500 years?" We'll pick up the next part with chapter 20. The title of that chapter is Fracas, Fracas, on page 135.